She was driving home from a 12-hour shift when the blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. 2 minutes later, Officer Darren Pruitt had his weapon out of the holster, and his partner was screaming for her to get on the ground. They thought they had cornered a nurse. They thought this was going to be easy. What they didn't know, what no one in Red Haven knew, was that the woman kneeling on the wet asphalt in her scrubs had once extracted wounded soldiers from a burning compound in hostile territory with nothing but a medical kit and a sidearm. They had no idea what they'd just started. If you're watching this for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about who gets believed and who gets buried. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Emily Tran drove home from Whitmore General Hospital, she was running on 4 hours of sleep and a gas station coffee that had gone cold somewhere around the third hour of a trauma case that refused to go quietly. She had a patient, 52 years old, construction foreman, came in with what his wife thought was indigestion, and Emily had been the one who caught the shadow on his EKG that everyone else almost missed. The attending physician got the credit. He usually did. Emily didn't argue about it. She just went back to her charting, finished her notes, clocked out at 11:47, and drove north on the Hargrove bypass toward the apartment she'd lived in for 3 years and never quite managed to turn into something that felt like home. The highway was empty in the way that late-night highways get empty. Not peaceful, just absent. A few long-haul trucks running south. A gas station every few miles with the fluorescent lights buzzing in the dark. Emily had the radio off and the window cracked because cold air was the only thing keeping her functional, and she was listening to the sound of the tires on the road and thinking about nothing in particular when she noticed the cruiser parked on the shoulder behind the Ridgemore overpass. She wasn't speeding. She knew she wasn't speeding because she never sped on this stretch. Not because she was cautious by nature, but because she'd learned years ago that certain highways, certain hours, certain faces behind a badge meant that the usual rules of being right didn't necessarily protect you. She eased off the gas anyway, kept both hands on the wheel, watched the cruiser in her peripheral vision as she passed. The lights came on before she'd cleared the overpass. Emily pulled over immediately, no hesitation, no drama. She came to a clean stop on the shoulder, put the car in park, turned on her hazards, and placed both hands on top of the steering wheel where they could be seen from outside. She had done this before. She knew exactly how to make herself as unthreatening as possible to men who had already decided she was a threat. The cruiser sat behind her for almost 2 minutes before anyone got out. She watched the mirrors. 2 officers. The one approaching on the driver's side was tall, built like someone who had spent his 20s in a weight room and his 30s eating badly, wide at the shoulders but soft in the middle, with a walk that said he was used to being the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. His nameplate read Pruitt. The one circling toward her passenger side was shorter, faster moving, with the kind of stillness in his face that Emily recognized not as calm, but as suppression, something held down under pressure. Del Vecchio. Pruitt got to her window. She had it down before he arrived. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation of why she'd been stopped. Emily reached slowly for the glove compartment, announced what she was doing before she did it. Old habit, military habit, the kind that kept situations from escalating unnecessarily, and produced her registration and insurance card. Her license was already in her hand. She passed everything through the window without being asked twice. Pruitt looked at the documents for a moment that lasted slightly too long. Emily Tran. He said her name the way some people said a word in a foreign language they were mispronouncing on purpose. Where are you coming from? Work. I'm a nurse at Whitmore General. I just finished a shift. Whitmore's east of the city. He tapped her license against his palm. This highway runs north. I take the Hargrove bypass. It's faster than the surface roads at this hour. Pruitt looked at her for a moment without saying anything. Behind him, she could see Del Vecchio standing at the rear corner of her car, just outside her sightline from the mirror. Not looking at her license plate. Just standing there, watching. "You been drinking tonight?" Pruitt asked. "No, I was working." "Step out of the vehicle." Emily looked at him. "Can you tell me why you pulled me over?" "I said step out of the vehicle." She got out. She kept her movement slow and visible and said nothing further. The night air hit her after the warmth of the car, and she felt it on her arms through her scrubs. The shoulder of the highway was loose gravel and a few inches of dead grass between the guardrail and the drop into the culvert below. Pruitt stepped back to give her room to stand, but not enough room. "Turn around, hands on the car." "I haven't done anything. Hands on the car." She put her hands on the roof. Pruitt patted her down with the kind of thoroughness that went past what any traffic stop required. She stayed still. She breathed. She cataloged everything: his position, Del Vecchio's position somewhere behind her, the distance to the guardrail, the angle of the headlights, the sound of a truck somewhere far south on the highway. She wasn't planning anything. She was just paying attention, the way she had been trained to pay attention in environments where not paying attention had consequences. "No weapons," Pruitt said, mostly to himself. "I'm a nurse. I work in an ER." She turned around when he stepped back. "Whatever you think you stopped me for, I'd like to understand what it was." Pruitt handed her documents back to her but didn't step far enough away. "We've been getting reports of a vehicle matching yours driving erratically through this corridor." "I wasn't driving erratically. That's not what I said." He had a particular way of correcting her that wasn't quite an interruption, just a repositioning of the conversation, like moving a chess piece. "I said a vehicle matching yours." "My car isn't uncommon. There must be thousands of—" "Why do you live all the way out on the north end when you work east?" Del Vecchio said it from behind her. She turned slightly so she could see him in her peripheral vision. He hadn't moved from the rear of her car. "Doesn't that seem like a lot of driving for a nurse's salary?" Emily looked at him. "I don't think that's relevant to a traffic stop. Just making conversation." "Are we having a conversation or am I being detained?" Neither of them answered that. Pruitt walked back toward his cruiser without explanation, taking her documents with him again. Del Vecchio stayed where he was. Emily stood at the side of her car with her hands visible at her sides and the cold working its way through her scrubs, and she reminded herself that this was an inconvenience, not a crisis. She had survived things that made this look like a misunderstanding. She just needed to be patient and careful and let it play out. It took Pruitt 11 minutes to run her license. She timed it. She knew her license was clean. She knew there was nothing on her record that could justify this length of time. But she also knew that the length of time wasn't about what was on her record. It was about something else. When Pruitt came, he brought a different energy with him, something that had shifted while he was in the cruiser. He handed her documents back without looking at her face, and when he finally did look at her, his expression had changed in a way she couldn't immediately name. "You're free to go," he said. Emily took her documents. "Would you like to tell me the real reason for the stop?" "Have a good night, ma'am." She got back in her car. She pulled out onto the highway slowly, watching the cruiser in her mirrors until the overpass swallowed it behind her, and she drove the remaining 9 miles to her apartment with her hands at 10 and 2 and her mind running a loop that had nothing to do with traffic laws or tired eyes or the patient from tonight. Something was wrong. She didn't know what it was yet, but she had spent enough time in situations that felt wrong before they announced themselves to know that the feeling was rarely mistaken. She had moved to Red Haven 3 years ago, after the end of a life she didn't talk about. Emily Tran had served 8 years in the United States Navy as a hospital corpsman, assigned to a SEAL Team combat unit in her 5th year after a series of evaluations that almost no woman had ever passed at that level. She didn't pass them because she was exceptional in the ways people expected. She wasn't the fastest or the strongest or the most naturally gifted with a weapon. She passed them because she was precise, because she could function under conditions that made other people fracture, and because she had a specific and unusual ability to assess situations that were moving faster than most people could think. She'd done 2 tours. She'd brought people back from situations they shouldn't have survived. She'd also seen things that lived behind her eyes in the hours between 3 and 5 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, and eventually she had come to understand that her body's threshold for absorbing violence, even necessary violence, even the violence that saved lives, had a limit she had reached. She didn't frame it as trauma. She didn't really have a word for it. She just knew that at a certain point, she needed the work to be about bringing people back without the other part. So she left the Navy, went back through nursing certification at full credential level, and found a job in an ER in a mid-sized city that wasn't quite big enough to be anonymous, but wasn't small enough that everyone knew everything about you. Red Haven suited her. She liked the pace of the hospital. She liked the work of it, the exactness, the way a correct decision in the right window of time could reverse outcomes that looked irreversible. She was good at her job in ways that occasionally made attending physicians uncomfortable because she had the instincts of someone who had been practicing medicine in field conditions without the institutional structure that usually shaped a medical career. She didn't always explain her reasoning in the approved sequence. She just knew what she saw. She had never told anyone at Whitmore General about her service. Not her nursing director, not the friends she'd made in the department, not Dr. Solis, who had been supervising her work for 2 years and who she trusted more than most people. She wore long sleeves in summer so no one would ask about her forearms. She gave the same answer to any direct question about her background. College, certification, worked at a clinic for 2 years before Whitmore. And it was accurate as far as it went. She'd just learned that the full version of who she was tended to change people's behavior toward her in ways she found exhausting. She wanted to be Emily Tran, ER nurse. Not Emily Tran, Navy SEAL. The first one let her do her work. The second one turned her into something for other people to have feelings about. 3 days after the highway stop, someone broke into her car. She found it at 6 in the morning when she was heading to a day shift, driver's side window smashed, glass on the seat, the glove compartment standing open. Nothing appeared to be missing. Her charger was still there. The small amount of cash she kept in the center console was untouched. Whoever had done it had gone through her registration documents and her insurance card, which were scattered across the passenger seat, and then apparently left without taking anything. Emily stood on the sidewalk outside her building and looked at it for a moment. Then she called the non-emergency police line, reported the break-in, got a case number, took photos of everything with her phone, and called a glass repair service. She was at work by 7:30. She told herself it was random. She almost believed it. The next night, driving home on a different route, not the Hargrove bypass, just city streets, she noticed a car running dark about 3 lengths behind her. No headlights. That was the tell. She tested it twice. A left turn that wasn't on her way home, then a right, then doubling back through a neighborhood. The car stayed with her. She got to her building, parked, went inside, and spent 40 minutes watching the street from her window. The car sat at the corner for an hour, then drove away. She wrote down the plate number. She didn't call anyone. She wasn't sure yet who she would call. She went to work the next morning and did her job and said nothing to anyone. And in the margins of that day, between a pediatric respiratory case and an MVA in the afternoon, she started thinking about the one thing she had been deliberately not thinking about for 3 days. What had Pruitt found when he ran her license? Her basic driving record was clean and connected to her current identity without issue. But her military service record, classified at certain levels, partially redacted, with service dates that lined up with operations she had never and could never speak about publicly, existed in federal databases that standard police background checks didn't normally reach. Except sometimes they did, if someone knew how to request access, or if someone had a contact inside who could pull the flag that appeared on the screen when her name came up in the system. She didn't know what he'd seen. She didn't know why he was interested, but she was increasingly sure that the traffic stop hadn't been about traffic. 4 days later, on a Thursday night, she was parking in the lot behind her building when they came. It wasn't just Pruitt and Delvecchio this time. There were 2 vehicles, a marked cruiser and an unmarked black SUV, and 4 men, and they moved with the coordinated speed of people who had agreed on the order of things before they arrived. Pruitt came at her directly. One of the others went around the left side of her car. The other 2 stayed near the SUV. Emily Tran, step away from the vehicle, so she was already out of the car. She took 1 step back toward the building. What's this about? We have questions about an incident that occurred on the highway on the 14th. We'd like you to come with us voluntarily for questioning. At 10:30 at night, in a private parking lot, without any advance notice. Are you refusing to cooperate? I'm asking a basic question. If you have questions about what happened on the 14th, you can ask me now, right here, and I'll answer them. Or you can contact my attorney and arrange a proper interview. What you're describing isn't standard procedure for witness questioning. Pruitt looked at her for a moment. In the overhead light of the parking lot, she could see something in his face that she hadn't clocked clearly on the highway. A tightness around the eyes that wasn't anger exactly, but was something adjacent to it, something managed. We found your name connected to a flagged federal record, he said. We have reason to believe you may be misrepresenting your background. I haven't misrepresented anything. Then come with us, and we'll clear it up. With legal representation present, Pruitt's hand moved toward his belt. Not fast, almost casual, the way you might reach for your keys. But she saw it, and she made a decision in the interval between one breath and the next. "I'm going to reach into my pocket for my phone," Emily said. Her voice was completely level. "I'm going to call my sister, who is an attorney, and then we are all going to stand here while she advises me on whether voluntary cooperation in an informal nighttime parking lot visit constitutes anything I should agree to." She reached into her pocket and took out her phone, slowly, deliberately. "No one needs to escalate this." Pruitt stepped forward. "Put the phone away." "I have the right to contact—" "I said put the phone away." He was close now, closer than any professional distance justified. His hand was no longer moving toward his belt. It was on his belt. "This is your last opportunity to cooperate before this becomes something different." And then several things happened fast. The man who had circled to her left moved on her, came in from her blind side with the speed of someone who had timed the moment. And Emily's body did what it had been trained to do before her conscious mind could run the calculation. She turned into him, took the force of the movement and redirected it, and he went down hard on the asphalt. Pruitt pulled his weapon. She dropped below the line of it, came up inside his reach, and the weapon ended up on the ground. She stepped back, hands raised, and the gun was 3 feet behind her on the pavement. Silence. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Pruitt was breathing hard. The man on the asphalt was getting up slowly. The other two were frozen near the SUV. Emily's hands were still raised. Her heart was not pounding. It wasn't calm exactly. There was a thin electrical charge running up both arms. But it wasn't panic either. This was the thing about her training that she had never been able to explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it. In the moment, there was no fear. The fear came later. In the moment, there was only sequence. "Nobody fired a weapon," she said. "Nobody is hurt. Whatever just happened, it doesn't have to be anything other than a misunderstanding." She looked directly at Pruitt. "I would like to call my sister." Pruitt picked up his weapon. His hand was not steady. He looked at her with something in his face that had gone past the managed tightness she'd seen earlier and arrived at something rawer and less controlled. "You're going to regret this," he said. "I hope not," Emily said. And she meant it. She called her sister Maggie from the parking lot before she went inside, standing under the overhead light with her back to the building wall and her sight lines clear in all 3 directions. Maggie Tran was 3 years older, a civil rights attorney in Caldwell, 2 hours east, and the only person in Emily's current life who knew the full version of who Emily was. "I need you to listen to something," Emily said when Maggie picked up. "I'm going to tell you exactly what just happened. All of it." She told her. All of it. The highway stop, the broken window, the car running dark, tonight. There was a silence on the other end that Emily recognized as Maggie thinking. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Did you hurt anyone?" "One of them went down when he grabbed at me. He got up on his own." "Did anyone pull a trigger?" "No." "Okay." Another pause. If what you're describing is accurate, and I'm taking your word for it, this is not a random run of bad luck. This is coordinated." "I know." "Which means someone pulled your file, not just your driving record, your actual file." "That's what I've been trying to figure out." "Do you have any idea what they're looking for, or what they think they found?" Emily leaned against the building wall and looked up at the black sky over the parking lot. Somewhere behind the light pollution, there were stars she couldn't see. "Not yet, but I think I need to find out before they try again." "I'm coming tomorrow," Maggie said. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't go to the police. And for the love of everything, stop parking in that lot alone at night." Emily almost said something about the parking lot being the least of her concerns, but Maggie had already moved on to practical logistics. So she just listened and said yes in the right places and stayed under the light until she heard the building door lock behind her. Inside her apartment, she didn't turn on the main lights. She went to the window by instinct and looked down at the parking lot. The black SUV was gone. The cruiser was gone. The lot was empty. She stood there for a while in the dark, not out of fear, but out of habit. Staying still and visible in lit spaces was a choice you made. Sometimes the better choice was stillness and darkness, and taking your time with what you knew. She knew this much. They had accessed something in her record that a standard traffic stop didn't give them access to. They had surveilled her property and her movement. They had attempted to take her in informally at night without following procedure. And when that failed, when she didn't fold, the officer in charge had told her she was going to regret it. That last part was the one that kept landing. Not as a threat she was afraid of, but as information. Because in her experience, people didn't say you were going to regret something unless they already had a plan for what came next. She pulled her go bag out of the closet, a habit left over from a life she had tried to leave behind, kept under old clothes, never unpacked. She set it by the bed. She lay down on top of the covers in her clothes, and she looked at the ceiling and she started thinking about what she knew and what she needed to find out and what she was going to do about the fact that something she had buried very carefully 3 years ago had apparently just been found. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail, then played the message. There was no voice, just the sound of a scanner, police frequencies, traffic calls, the ordinary noise of a night shift dispatch, running for about 4 seconds. Then a click. Emily put the phone down. She had spent years being someone who helped people survive the worst nights of their lives. She was good at it. She found meaning in it. She had built something real out of the parts of herself that hadn't been destroyed, and she had done it carefully and quietly and without making any claims about who she was or what she'd survived. The thing she had never let herself consider was what would happen when the past came looking for her specifically. Now it had. And whoever was driving it had just made the mistake of leaving her phone number in its wake, because that meant they wanted her afraid and reactive, not informed and prepared. She wasn't afraid. She was thinking. Outside, a car turned into the lot below her window and moved slowly through the rows of parked vehicles. No urgency, just deliberate, before pulling back out onto the street without stopping. Emily watched it go. Then she reached under the mattress, where she kept the one thing she had moved with her from every apartment for 3 years and never once thought she would need, and she held it in her hands in the dark for a moment before setting it on the nightstand. Whoever had started this had done it because they thought they knew what she was. They had no idea. She didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid. Fear was a different thing, something that moved in the body and demanded action or paralysis. This was something colder, something that kept her mind turning over the same set of facts the way you'd work a dislocated joint, carefully, trying to find the angle that revealed the damage underneath. By 4 a.m, she had her phone out and was running searches, careful ones, nothing that would flag on a monitored network. She used her data plan instead of the building's Wi-Fi and kept the queries oblique. Red Haven PD internal affairs complaints filed in the last 18 months. City Council hearing records on department oversight. Any reporting on misconduct that had been buried or delayed. She found fragments, nothing complete. A lawsuit filed by a man named Delroy Watkins 2 years ago, alleging evidence planting during a drug arrest, dismissed on procedural grounds. A union grievance from a former department investigator who had resigned abruptly and moved out of state. 3 council members who had publicly requested an independent audit of the department's use of force protocols, and then, 6 months later, quietly dropped the request without explanation. None of it pointed directly at Pruitt, but patterns didn't always need to be direct. She closed her phone at 5:15 and lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling until the light changed outside her window and the first garbage truck of the morning ground its way up the street below. And then she got up, changed clothes, and started coffee because some part of normalcy was worth maintaining even when the situation was not normal. Maggie arrived at 11:40 in a silver rental car with a rolling carry-on and the expression she'd had since childhood that meant she was already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. She was taller than Emily, wider through the shoulders, with their mother's tendency to take up space as a deliberate assertion rather than an accident. She came inside, dropped the bag, and said, "Show me everything." Emily showed her everything. Maggie sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, actual paper, actual pen, old habits from law school, and wrote while Emily talked. The highway stop, the car, the surveillance, the parking lot, the phone call. She didn't interrupt, didn't editorialize, just wrote and occasionally asked for a specific detail to be repeated. The time on the clock when Pruitt had first reached for his weapon, the exact words he'd used, the configuration of the 2 vehicles in the lot. When Emily finished, Maggie looked at the pad for a moment. "You disarmed a police officer." "He pulled on me first." I understand that. I'm not questioning your judgment. I'm telling you how it reads in a report." She tapped the pad with her pen. "If Pruitt files an assault on officer charge, he can't do that without explaining why he was there, who authorized the informal questioning, and why an unmarked SUV was involved in a routine witness interview. Right, which means he probably won't file, which means he'll come at you a different way. Maggie leaned back. Has anyone at the hospital said anything to you? Anything off? Emily thought about that. No? Why? Because if someone is trying to neutralize you, the hospital is a vector. Your employment, your license, your access to patients. It's leverage. Emily hadn't gone there yet in her thinking. She filed it. What I need to understand, Maggie said, is why now? Your record has been accessible for 3 years. If someone wanted to find the flag in your file, they've had time. Something changed recently. Something you did, or something you saw, or something someone else did that put you in proximity to information you weren't supposed to have. The question dropped into Emily's mind and found a specific place to land, and she felt the arrival of it like a physical thing, the particular sensation of a puzzle piece contacting its correct location. She thought about the patient from 4 nights ago, the construction foreman, the EKG shadow she had caught, and then she thought about what she'd overheard in the hallway outside his room at the end of her shift, when 2 men she didn't recognize had been talking to the attending physician in low voices, and one of them had a badge clipped to his belt that she'd caught a partial look at, and she'd thought nothing of it at the time because hospital administrators and insurance people and various official-looking individuals moved through the ER constantly, and there was always something that didn't require her attention, except the badge hadn't been hospital administration. The shape of it and the color of it had been wrong for that. Something happened at work, she said slowly. I don't know what it means yet. Maggie looked at her. Tell me. The construction foreman's name was Russell Holt, and by the time Emily arrived at Whitmore General for her shift that afternoon, he had been moved to the cardiac ICU on the 4th floor. That wasn't unusual for the severity of what he'd presented with. What was unusual was that when she asked the charge nurse how he was doing, casual, collegial, the way nurses asked about patients they'd worked, she was told that his records had been restricted to attending-level access only. That was unusual. ER nurses didn't typically get locked out of post-admission records for patients they'd triaged. It happened occasionally for legal reasons, but it required a specific request and a documented rationale. Emily nodded and went back to work and said nothing more about it. During her break, she found Dr. Solis in the physician's lounge, which meant she had about 6 minutes before his pager went off again. Marcus Solis was 51, had been attending at Whitmore for 14 years, and had the quality of someone who had stopped performing authority somewhere around year 7, because he no longer needed to. He was eating a sandwich and reading something on his phone, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of someone who had learned to reserve their attention for things that actually needed it. Quick question, Emily said, sitting across from him. Russell Holt, cardiac ICU, came through my intake 4 nights ago. His records got restricted. Do you know why? Solis put his phone down. Not a dramatic movement, just the movement of someone giving the conversation its appropriate weight. Where'd you hear that? Donna mentioned it when I asked how he was doing. He's stable. Solis said it in a particular way, not evasive but shaped carefully. The restriction came from administration. For what reason? They didn't say. I was told it was a legal matter. He picked up his sandwich again. Emily, leave it. She looked at him. In 14 months of working under Marcus Solis, she had never heard him use that tone with her. Not dismissive, not condescending, but weighted, like a warning that was trying to be a kindness. Okay, she said. She left it. For now. That evening, walking to her car after the shift ended, she passed the east stairwell and heard voices from the landing above. 2 men, not bothering to be particularly quiet, speaking in the specific register of people who believe they are unobserved. She caught fragments, the name Holt, the words liability exposure, and before the 30-day window, and then something about a site report that should have stayed buried. She kept walking. She didn't slow down. She got to her car and sat in it for 2 minutes before pulling out of the lot. Site report. Russell Holt was a construction foreman. A site report was a document that recorded conditions, incidents, accidents at a work site. And when those reports conflicted with what was later alleged in a legal or insurance claim, they became extremely valuable to one side and extremely dangerous to the other. She didn't know what Russell Holt had seen or done or reported. She didn't know who the men in the stairwell were or who they worked for. She knew only that his records had been restricted, that she'd been told to leave it by someone she trusted, and that 4 days earlier she had been pulled over on a deserted highway by two officers who seemed to have accessed a level of her background that should have been well outside their reach. She was not a detective, she was a nurse. She fixed what came in front of her, but she had also spent years learning how to read a situation developing faster than the words being used to describe it, and what was developing here had a shape she recognized. Maggie spent 2 days in Emily's apartment making calls and writing notes, and occasionally using language that would have surprised their mother. She had contacts at the state attorney's office, contacts in federal public defender's offices, contacts from cases she had worked that crossed jurisdictions in ways that meant she knew people who could ask questions unofficially. She was careful and methodical and slightly frightening, and Emily let her work and stayed out of the way because Maggie, in investigative mode, was like a piece of heavy equipment, powerful, necessary, and best given appropriate clearance. On the second evening, Maggie came out of the bedroom where she'd been on the phone for 2 hours and sat down on the couch across from Emily with the legal pad and the specific expression Emily associated with her receiving information she didn't like. "Tell me about a company called Dravex Infrastructure," Maggie said. Emily looked at her. "Never heard of it." "They're a mid-sized construction and site management company operating primarily in this region. They have contracts with the city, roads, utilities, that kind of thing. They also have a lawsuit pending in federal court alleging that they misclassified a workplace accident at a site on the south end of the city 18 months ago. An accident in which one worker died and 2 were injured." Maggie looked at the pad. "The lead site foreman on the project was a man named Russell Holt." The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. "Holt filed an internal incident report that contradicted the company's official account," Maggie continued. "The company's account said the accident was the result of worker error. Holt's report said it was the result of equipment that had been certified as safe by a city inspector who had received payments from Dravex." She looked up. "The city inspector works out of the Red Haven Municipal Office. His supervisor is a man named Victor Calloway, who is the deputy director of city infrastructure and has a 30-year friendship with Red Haven's police commander, Dale Shreve." Emily said nothing for a moment. "Holt got sick," Maggie said. "Cardiac event. If he was the primary witness to the contents of that report, and if his condition meant he couldn't testify in the next 30 days, the federal case hits a procedural wall." She paused. "I'm not saying anyone caused his heart attack. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that Russell Holt is inconvenient to several powerful people, and the nurse who admitted him and flagged his cardiac presentation and has a federal service record with classified markings just happened to get pulled over and surveilled and informally threatened within 72 hours of his admission." Emily looked at her sister. "You're saying they think I saw something?" "I'm saying they pulled your record, found a level of clearance and training that scared them, and decided preemptive action was preferable to finding out whether you were a problem." "I didn't see anything, not at the time." "No, but you have now." The next morning, Emily went back to work because the alternative was sitting still, and she had never been good at sitting still. She did her job. She was careful and precise. And when she assessed patients, she did what she always did, read what was actually in front of her, not what the chart suggested she should expect. A 12-year-old girl in for what the triage notes described as an allergic reaction was actually having an atypical seizure variant, and Emily was the one who caught the distinction before it became something irreversible. The attending got there 2 minutes later and made the call, and the kid was stable, and the attending said good catch and moved on because that was the rhythm of the ER, and Emily fell back into it and let it carry her. At 2:15, she received a text from an unknown number, 4 words, "Stop asking about Holt." She stared at it for a moment, then she screenshotted it, sent the screenshot to Maggie, and deleted the text. Then she went back to work because standing in a hospital hallway staring at her phone was not going to help anyone. What she did not do was stop. At the end of her shift, she went to the 4th-floor visitors area, not the CICU, just the waiting room outside it, and sat for 20 minutes in the middle of the other people who were there waiting for news about people they loved. A woman her mother's age knitting something in green yarn. A man in his 40s in a work jacket staring at the floor. A teenager asleep across 2 chairs with his shoes still on. Emily sat among them and felt the ordinary weight of what that space contained. Worry and waiting, and the particular exhaustion of loving someone who might not come back. and she thought about Russell Holt in a room down the corridor and what he had written in a report, that enough people wanted buried badly enough that they had moved against a nurse with a government flag in her file. She didn't try to see him. That wasn't what she was there for. She was there to confirm something she needed to confirm in person, that the two men she'd seen in the stairwell were still in the building. They were. She spotted one of them through the CICU's glass partition. Different clothes than before, but the same build, the same posture, the particular stillness of someone performing patience. He was sitting in a chair outside Holt's room where family members would normally sit, reading a newspaper he hadn't turned a page of in the 10 minutes she watched him. She left before he could notice her. In the elevator going down, she let herself feel what was underneath the operational surface for exactly the length of time it took to get from the 4th floor to the lobby. There was anger there. Not the hot kind, but the compressed kind, the kind that had weight and could sustain itself over long distances. There was something that might have been fear if she had let it develop that far. And there was something that felt, if she was being precise about it, like recognition. She knew this structure. She had seen it before, not in hospitals, but in environments where the people who knew inconvenient things had a way of becoming casualties before the inconvenient things could reach the surface. She had spent years trying to leave that world behind. The world, apparently, had decided not to stay left. Maggie was on the phone when Emily got home, and she held up one finger without looking up. Wait. And Emily waited, standing in the kitchen, and listened to Maggie's side of the conversation, which was almost entirely listening with occasional affirmations, until Maggie said, "Send it to the secure address," and hung up. "I have a source in the city infrastructure office," Maggie said without preamble. Not a whistleblower, just someone who is tired of certain things and was willing to confirm certain other things off the record. She picked up the legal pad. The site inspector who certified Dravix's equipment was a man named Paul Gerard. He retired 14 months ago, unexpectedly, with a full pension payout that was 2 years ahead of his standard eligibility. The certification he signed off on, the one Holt's report directly contradicts, is dated 3 days before the accident. So the certification was retroactive. Or accelerated. Either way, it's falsified documentation connected to a workplace fatality, and Holt's testimony is the only thing that directly establishes it as such. Maggie looked at her. There's more. Commander Shreve, the police commander, his brother-in-law sits on the board of Dravix's parent company. Emily absorbed that. And Pruitt? Garrett Pruitt has been in the department for 11 years. He's had 2 internal affairs investigations dropped without findings. Both complaints were filed by people who subsequently moved out of the city. Maggie set the pad down. He's not freelancing, Em. Someone told him to run your name, and someone told him what to do about what he found. Shreve. Almost certainly. But proving it is a different problem. She paused. I want to go to the FBI field office in Caldwell. Not formally. I know someone there, a contact from a case 2 years ago. I want to put this in front of someone who has the capacity to act on it. Emily thought about that. If we approach the FBI and nothing moves fast enough, Shreve will know we went. That puts Holt at risk. I know. And it puts us more visibly in motion than we are right now. I know that too. Maggie looked at her steadily. But we don't have unlimited time before they decide that quiet pressure isn't working and try something more direct. You know that. Emily did know that. She'd known it since the parking lot. Give me 48 hours, she said. Maggie looked at her with the expression she'd had since they were children. Not skepticism, but the careful patience of someone who had learned that Emily's requests for time almost always led somewhere she wouldn't have thought to look. 48 hours, Maggie said. Then we go to Caldwell. That night, Emily sat at the table with her laptop and the notes she'd been building since the highway stop and started organizing everything into a sequence with evidence points and gaps clearly marked, because the difference between a story and a case was specificity, and she had enough years in environments where loose information got people killed to understand that what she was building needed to be more than convincing. It needed to be complete. She was halfway through the timeline when her phone rang. Not a text. Not an unknown number. Her actual phone, ringing with an incoming call from a number she recognized, the main line of Whitmore General's administration office, calling at 11:20 at night. She answered. Ms. Tran. A man's voice, formal, HR department smooth. I'm sorry to call at this hour. My name is Gerald Fitch. I'm the Director of Human Resources at Whitmore General. I need to inform you that we've received a formal complaint regarding your conduct, and effective tomorrow morning, your access credentials have been suspended pending a review. You'll receive written notification by 7 a.m. Emily kept her voice level. What's the nature of the complaint? I'm not able to share specifics over the phone. The written notification will contain the details. I've worked at this hospital for 3 years without a single complaint. Can you tell me who filed it? I'm not able to share that information at this time. Ms. Tran, I do want to say that this is a preliminary action, not a termination. The review process is— I understand, she said. I'll wait for the written notification. She hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. They had moved faster than 48 hours. She looked at Maggie's bedroom door, visible from where she was sitting, closed and dark. And she considered waking her and then decided to let her sleep because the next 24 hours were going to require Maggie to be sharp, and there was nothing either of them could do about this before morning. She looked back at the laptop, at the timeline she'd been building, at the gap in the center of it where the most important missing piece still waited, the one thing she hadn't been able to confirm yet, the thread that connected all the other pieces into something that could be used. There was someone she needed to find, someone who had filed an incident report and then gotten sick and then been moved into a guarded room on the 4th floor of a hospital where Emily no longer had access credentials. She stared at the timeline. A suspended nurse couldn't walk into the CICU, but a woman with 8 years of experience moving through hostile territory undetected could find another way in. She picked up her phone and started looking for Russell Holt's wife. Sandra Holt answered on the 3rd ring, and her voice had the particular texture of someone who had been running on bad sleep and worse coffee for days, frayed at the edges, but not broken. Not yet. Mrs. Holt, my name is Emily Tran. I'm a nurse at Whitmore General. I was part of the team that admitted your husband last week. A pause. I remember you. You were the one in the ER who kept asking questions the other doctor wasn't asking. That's right. Emily chose her next words with care. I know it's late, and I know you have enough happening right now without a phone call from someone you don't know. But I need to speak with you in person, not at the hospital, somewhere private. Another pause, longer. What's this about? It's about why your husband's room has a man sitting outside it who isn't hospital staff. The silence that followed told Emily everything she needed to know about whether Sandra Holt had noticed the same thing. They met the next morning at a diner called Hartwell's on the west side of the city, far enough from both the hospital and Emily's neighborhood that the choice felt deliberate without being obvious. Sandra Holt was in her early 50s, stocky and direct, with the hands of someone who had spent a long time doing physical work before whatever she did now. She arrived 5 minutes early, which Emily respected. She ordered coffee and didn't touch it, which Emily also noted. He told me not to talk to anyone, Sandra said, before they moved him upstairs. He said if anyone from Dravex came around or anyone connected to the city, I should say nothing and call the lawyer. Who's his lawyer? A man named Okafor, Bernard Okafor. He's been handling the federal case. She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. He came to the hospital 2 days ago. They wouldn't let him into the room. Said Russell was too unstable for visitors. Is he unstable? Sandra looked at her directly. When I see him, he's tired. He's recovering, but he's not so unstable that a lawyer can't sit with him for 20 minutes. Emily nodded. She pulled out her phone and showed Sandra the screenshot of the text she'd received. Stop asking about Holt, and watched Sandra's face change in the specific way faces changed when something they'd privately feared was confirmed. What do you know about the incident report? Emily asked. Sandra was quiet for a moment. I know Russell wrote one. I know it said things that contradicted what Dravex put in their official filing. He told me it was the right thing to do, and that someone had died, and that he wasn't going to let it get buried. She looked out the window. He also told me he was scared. Russell doesn't scare easy. He's been in construction for 23 years. He's seen things go wrong, and he's seen companies cover things up, and he handled it. But this time was different. She looked back at Emily. He said the inspector who signed the safety certification, Gerard, he knew Gerard. They'd worked together on 2 previous projects. And Russell said Gerard told him, off the record, right after the accident, that he'd been pressured into signing the cert, that he'd documented his objections internally and been told to lose the documentation. Do you know where that internal documentation went? Russell said Gerard kept a copy. That's all I know. Emily thought about that. Paul Gerard, early retired, full pension buyout, somewhere in the city or possibly not in the city anymore. A copy of documentation that directly contradicted an official certification connected to a workplace fatality and a federal lawsuit and a man in a guarded hospital room. I need you to contact Bernard Okafor today, Emily said. Tell him what you just told me. Tell him about the access restriction and the man outside Russell's room. And tell him my name. She took a card from her pocket, personal, not hospital, and slid it across the table. I've been suspended from Whitmore pending a complaint. I don't know what the complaint says, but I know who filed it, and Okafor needs to know that too. Sandra picked up the card. Why are you doing this? You don't know us. Emily considered the honest answer for a moment. Because I admitted your husband and I saw something that suggested a cardiac event, and I was right, and he survived. And now someone is trying to use that to control the situation. I don't like that. It wasn't the complete truth, but it was the part of it that mattered to Sandra Holt right now, and Emily could see that it landed. I'll call him today, Sandra said. Boss. Maggie was not happy about the suspension. Happy was the wrong word. She was operational about it, immediately beginning to document the timeline and requesting the written complaint through the hospital's HR channels before Emily had even finished telling her. But underneath the operational efficiency, there was a specific kind of anger that Emily recognized as Maggie's version of being frightened, and she let it run without comment because there was nothing useful she could say about it. The written complaint arrived by email at 7:04 a.m. as promised. Emily read it twice. The complaint alleged that she had accessed restricted patient records without authorization, specifically the file of Russell Holt, and had made inappropriate contact with hospital personnel regarding the details of his case. It was signed by Dr. Ansel Corby, the chief medical officer of Whitmore General, a man Emily had spoken to exactly twice in 3 years at 2 all-staff meetings. She had not accessed Holt's restricted records. She had asked Donna how he was doing and been told access was restricted. There was a difference, but the complaint was not interested in the difference. Corby, Maggie said, reading over her shoulder. You know him? By name. He's administration, not clinical. He signed this yesterday at 4 p.m. That's after your shift ended. Maggie straightened up. Which means someone contacted him during business hours and convinced him to file this. That's not a spontaneous complaint. That's arranged. I know. Okafor. You said you gave Sandra his name. He needs to see this complaint too. Maggie was already reaching for her phone. I'm also calling my contact at the FBI field office. Not formally yet, just to make sure someone outside this city knows what's happening. She stopped. I need you to understand that the 48 hours is gone. We are past the point where this stays local and manageable. These people suspended your license to get you out of the hospital, and the only reason to do that is to remove you from proximity to Holt before... She stopped again. Before what? Maggie looked at her. Before whatever they're planning to do about Holt. The room felt different after she said it. Not the temperature or the light, something in the air, the particular quality of a situation that had been theoretical until it wasn't. Emily picked up her laptop and pulled up what she'd built the night before. Then I need to find Paul Gerard. Gerard wasn't hard to find. He was retired, not hiding. His name was on a property record for a house in the Millhaven district, a 15-minute drive south of the city center. Emily found it in 40 minutes of careful searching through public records databases that anyone could access if they knew how to sequence the queries. She found a phone number attached to the address through a voter registration record, and she thought about calling and then decided against it because a phone call gave someone time to not be home in a way that a knock on the door didn't. She drove to Millhaven alone. Maggie objected. Emily told her someone needed to stay near the apartment in case the situation there developed, which was true, but also a way of making sure Maggie wasn't in the car when Emily made a decision Maggie would have stopped her from making. Paul Gerard answered his door in work clothes, the kind of clothes people wore when they were doing something around the house, paint-specked jeans and an old flannel. And he looked at Emily for a moment with the expression of someone who had been expecting visitors who weren't welcome for long enough that the anticipation had become its own exhaustion. You're not from Dravex, he said, more an observation than a question. No, my name is Emily Tran. I'm a nurse at Whitmore General. I admitted Russell Holt last week. He looked at her for another moment. Then he opened the door wider. The inside of the house was orderly,
in the way of someone who had lived alone long enough to develop systems.
He led her to the kitchen table without asking if she wanted anything, and they sat across from each other with the morning light coming through the window above the sink. And Emily told him what she knew, compressed and in order, without editorializing. Gerard listened without interrupting. His face was hard to read, not closed exactly, but worn, like a surface that had been weathered past the point of expressing surprise at weather. When she finished, he said, "How bad is Russell?" "He was stable when I last had access. His wife says he's recovering." "But you don't have access anymore." "No." He looked at the table for a moment. "I documented my objections to that certification in a formal memo filed with the City Infrastructure Office. Standard procedure. You put it in writing, you create a record, you do your job." He paused. 2 days after I filed it, my supervisor called me in and told me the memo had been submitted incorrectly and had been removed from the system on procedural grounds, and that I needed to resubmit with a corrected format. I asked for a copy of what I'd submitted. He told me it wasn't available because it had been removed from the system. So the original disappeared. Officially, I kept a copy, printed it the day I filed it before anyone had a chance to touch it. He looked at her steadily. I kept it because I knew what the certification meant. I certified equipment that I had formally noted as requiring additional inspection, and I did it because I was told the project timeline didn't allow for a delay and that my concerns were on the record, except then they weren't on the record. And then a man died. Emily held his gaze. "Do you still have the printed copy?" Gerard was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a dog was barking somewhere down the street, and someone was running a leaf blower, and the ordinary sounds of an ordinary neighborhood did nothing to change the weight of what was sitting between them at this table. "The copies," he said. "Plural. I made 4. He got up and went down the hallway, and Emily sat and listened to the house around her and breathed. And when he came back, he was carrying a manila folder that was not new. The edges were worn, the clasp was bent, and it had clearly been opened and closed many times over 18 months of someone living with what was inside it. He set it on the table. He didn't open it yet. "If I give you this," he said, "there's no going back to the arrangement I had, the pension, the quiet, the leaving it alone." "I know." "They'll come after me." "Yes, they probably will." Emily didn't soften it because softening it would have been a lie, and he deserved better than that. "But Russell Holt is in a guarded room, and someone is trying to keep him from testifying in a federal case that involves a man's death. And I've been removed from the hospital where I can monitor what's happening to him. And the people doing this have a police commander in their network." She looked at him directly. "Whatever arrangement you had, they've already decided you're only protected as long as you're useful. The moment this gets worse, and it is going to get worse, that arrangement means nothing." Gerard looked at the folder. Then he pushed it across the table. "There's a recording too," he said. "Voicemail. My supervisor telling me the memo had been administratively resolved. I kept it on an old phone I never reconnected. I'll need to charge it first." Emily called Maggie on the drive back. "I have the documentation," she said. A beat of silence. "All of it?" "Most of it. There's a voicemail that needs to be recovered from an old device, and we need Okafor to know about Gerard today." "Okay." She could hear Maggie shifting into a different gear. "My FBI contact, his name is Derek Fossey. He said he can meet informally, but he needs to understand the full scope before he takes anything upstairs. He said if there's a federal case already in play, there's a path for this to move faster than a standard investigation." "How fast?" "If the documentation is what you're saying it is," he said, 48 to 72 hours for a preliminary action. Emily drove and thought. 48 to 72 hours was not nothing. 48 to 72 hours was also not nothing for Russell Holt in a room with a man reading a newspaper outside his door. "Tell Fossey we'll be in Caldwell tonight." They drove to Caldwell in Maggie's rental because Emily's car had been sitting in front of her building for 2 days, and she had to assume it was being tracked. She packed the folder in her bag and kept it between her feet on the passenger side and watched the mirrors the whole 2 hours because that was the kind of thinking she was in now. Not from paranoia, but from the accumulated evidence of what these people were willing to do. Derek Foss was a lean, quiet man in his mid-40s who met them at a coffee place near the field office rather than inside it, which Emily took as a sign that he was being careful about what his presence in this meeting suggested officially. He ordered nothing and read the documentation Maggie had organized. The complaint, the timeline, Gerard's printed memo, the photograph Emily had taken of the man outside Holt's room, without a visible reaction, which she also took as a good sign. People who reacted visibly to documentary evidence were usually doing it for the benefit of the room. When he finished, he looked up at Emily. "Your military record," he said. "What level?" "I'm not going to discuss my service record with you informally in a coffee shop." "Fair enough." He looked at the folder again. "This documentation, if it's authenticated, and we'd need chain of custody to be clean, creates a direct evidentiary link between falsified city inspection records and a federal workplace fatality case. The municipal connection to the police commander is a separate thread, but it's an important one." He paused. "You said the primary witness is currently in a hospital room with restricted access and an unknown individual positioned outside." "Yes. And you believe the intent is to prevent him from being available to testify within a procedural window." "That's what the timeline suggests." Fossey tapped the folder. "I can't promise a timeline. That's not how this works. But I can tell you that what you're describing, if it holds up, is not a local matter. The Dravix case has federal jurisdiction. Obstruction of a federal proceeding has federal jurisdiction. And interference with a witness in a federal case carries its own weight." "Then what happens next?" Maggie said. "I make some calls tonight, quietly. By tomorrow morning, I'll know what the internal situation is with the Dravix case and whether anyone on that team already has a flag on any of these names." He looked at Emily. "In the meantime, I need you to not do anything that moves this situation forward independently. No contact with Holt, no further contact with Gerard. Gerard has a voicemail on a stored device. His supervisor telling him the complaint memo was administratively resolved. I need someone to secure that." Fossey looked at her for a moment. "Where is he?" "Millhaven. I'll send you his address." "Okay." He picked up the folder. "And Ms. Tran, the suspension from the hospital. Don't fight it through HR channels yet. If this moves the way I think it could, the complaint disappears as part of a larger action, and fighting it now just makes noise that alerts people who shouldn't be alerted." Emily looked at him. "And if it doesn't move the way you think it could?" He was honest. "Then you fight it through HR channels. And I hope your attorney is good." Maggie said, with a particular quiet, "She is." They drove back to Red Haven at 10 that night. Emily slept for part of the drive, not voluntarily, just her body taking the time it could find, and woke up when Maggie hit the city limits and the highway lights came on around them. "Fossey seems solid," Maggie said. "Yeah." Emily straightened in the seat. "But 48 hours is a long time." "I know." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "Sandra Holt called while you were sleeping. Okafor got into the room today. They let him in for 20 minutes. "Good." "Russell told him something. Okafor wouldn't say what over the phone, but Sandra said Russell was agitated. The good kind, she said, like he wanted to move. Like he'd been waiting for someone to actually show up." Emily thought about that. A man who had filed a correct report and watched it disappear, who had been moved into a room and watched, who had survived a cardiac event and come back to a situation that had gotten harder in his absence. A man who was tired but not done. She understood that. They were passing the Ridgemore overpass, the one where Pruitt had been parked 3 weeks ago, where the blue lights had come on in her rearview mirror and started all of this. And Emily looked at it as they went under and felt the specific texture of a situation she was inside and couldn't yet see the edges of. She was reaching for her phone to check whether Fossey had sent any acknowledgement when Maggie said, "Em." Something in the way she said it made Emily look up. There were 2 cars behind them, not close, a reasonable following distance, but moving together, maintaining their interval with the specific consistency that was different from ordinary highway traffic. "How long?" Emily said. "Since we got off the bypass, maybe longer." Emily watched them in the mirror. The one on the left was dark-colored, a sedan. The one on the right was an SUV, dark, no markings she could see. "Don't speed up," she said. "Take the Mercer Street exit." Maggie took the exit. Both cars followed. "Okay," Emily said, and her voice came out flat and certain. And the version of herself that had been trained for exactly this kind of sequence came forward and took over from the part of her that had been hoping this could be resolved with documentation and federal contacts and 48 hours of patience. "I need you to drive to the 4th District Fire Station on Brennan Avenue. Pull directly into the apron in front of the bay doors. Leave the engine running." "Emily,
They won't move on us in front of a fire station with a camera above every bay door. She kept her eyes on the mirrors. And I need you to send Fosse our location right now. Text, not call. Everything that's in the folder. She paused. And Maggie? What? The folder is in my bag. If for any reason I'm not in the car, stop. If I'm not in the car, you take the folder to Fosse personally. Don't stop anywhere. Don't call me first. You go directly to the field office. Maggie's hands were white on the wheel, and her voice was controlled with the specific effort of someone who was refusing to let it be anything else. You're not going to not be in the car. No, I'm probably not. Emily kept her eyes on the mirrors. The two cars were still behind them, closer now. But I've been wrong about what probably happens before. Maggie took the turn onto Brennan Avenue, and Emily watched the cars behind them make the same turn and felt the situation compressing toward a point, and she reached into her bag with one hand and felt the weight of the one item she'd been carrying since the night she took it off the nightstand. And she thought about Russell Holt and Gerard's folder and Sandra's voice on the phone and the man who had died at a worksite because a certification had been signed under pressure. She thought about all the things that didn't make it to the surface because someone made sure they didn't. The fire station appeared ahead of them, bay doors lit and open on a slow night, two firefighters visible near one of the engines. Maggie pulled into the apron and stopped exactly where Emily had told her to stop, and the engine was still running, and the two cars slowed at the street entrance to the lot without pulling in. Emily watched them in the mirror. For about 15 seconds, nothing moved. Then the driver's door of the sedan opened, and Garrett Pruitt stepped out into the parking lot light with his badge visible and his hand on his hip, not on his weapon, not yet, and looked directly at Emily's side of the car with the expression of someone who had run out of patience for subtlety. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She looked down. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. Not Sandra, not Fosse, not Maggie. 2 words. Russell's gone. Emily stared at those 2 words for 3 seconds, and then she made herself stop staring and think. Russell's gone could mean dead. It could also mean moved, transferred, discharged, relocated by people who had decided the hospital was no longer the right place to control what he said and who he talked to. She didn't know which, and she couldn't call Sandra from the apron of a fire station with Garrett Pruitt 20 feet behind her in a parking lot, so she held both possibilities at the same time and let them both push on her, and she chose to treat the worst one as the working assumption, because that was the version that required her to move fastest. Pruitt was still standing outside the sedan. He wasn't approaching. The firefighters near the bay doors had noticed the situation in the loose, alert way that people noticed something that wasn't quite right, and one of them had his phone in his hand, which was exactly what Emily had needed them to do. She got out of the car. Not fast, not slow. Just got out, stood on the apron, and looked at Pruitt across the distance between them. The light above the bay doors was strong and even and put everything in clear visibility, and she was counting on that. "This is your 3rd attempt in 2 weeks," she said, loud enough that it carried. "You pulled me over on the 14th on the Hargrove bypass with no stated cause. You brought 4 officers and an unmarked vehicle to my residential parking lot at 10:30 at night, and now you followed a civilian vehicle on city streets." She kept her hands visible, away from her body. "Every one of those is documented. Every one of those has witnesses or recordings or both." Pruitt didn't move. Behind him, the driver of the SUV had not gotten out. "Ms. Tran," he said, and his voice was different than it had been in the parking lot. Tighter, like something being held under pressure that didn't have much margin left. "You're currently suspended from your place of employment pending a misconduct investigation. You've been in contact with a retired city inspector who is a witness in an active federal civil case, which may constitute witness interference. I'm here to what?" She didn't raise her voice. "To arrest me? Then arrest me. Right here, in front of this building, with those cameras." She looked directly at the camera mounted above the nearest bay door. "Or tell me what charge you're placing and call it in over your radio right now so there's a dispatch record." The firefighter with the phone had taken a photo. She'd seen the flash. Pruitt stood in the lot for another 5 seconds. Then he got back in the sedan. Both cars left. Emily stood on the apron until their taillights were gone from the end of the street, and then she got back in the car and said, "Drive," and Maggie drove, and neither of them said anything for 2 blocks. "He didn't have anything," Maggie said finally.
No, he was trying to rattle the situation into giving him something. Emily looked at her phone. The text was still there. He wanted me to do something reactive. What did the text say? Emily showed her. Maggie looked at it at a red light. Her jaw tightened. Sandra. Call her. Not from your regular number. Do you have the burner you bought for the Caldwell trip? Maggie reached into the center console without taking her eyes off the road and handed it over. Emily dialed Sandra from memory. She'd looked at the number enough times that it had settled, and waited. Sandra answered in 2 rings, and from the sound of her voice, Emily knew immediately that gone did not mean dead. They moved him, Sandra said, around 8 tonight. They said it was a transfer to a cardiac specialty facility in the Northern District for continued monitoring. They gave me an address. I went there, and it's a real facility, but they won't confirm he's been admitted, and they won't let me see him, and the number they gave me for the patient liaison just rings. Emily exhaled slowly. Okay, he's alive. They moved him somewhere they have better control of access. Why? Why would they do that? He's a cardiac patient. He's recovering because Okafor got in today, and someone decided the hospital wasn't contained enough anymore. Emily kept her voice level. Sandra, I need you to do something. Contact Okafor tonight, right now, and tell him exactly what you just told me. He needs to file an emergency petition with the federal court for access to Russell as a material witness. If Russell is a named witness in an active federal proceeding, restricting his attorney's access may constitute obstruction. Okafor knows how to move on that. Will that actually work? It creates a paper trail that has to be answered. That's what we need right now. She paused. And Sandra, don't go back to that facility tonight. Go somewhere that isn't your house. Do you have someone you can stay with? A brief silence. My sister. Go there. She hung up and looked at Maggie. The specialty facility on the north end. I need its full name. I heard. Give me a minute. Maggie turned onto a street Emily didn't recognize. She was routing deliberately, not taking direct lines, and kept driving while Emily pulled up everything she could find on cardiac specialty facilities in the Northern District. There were 2. One was a well-documented, long-standing rehabilitation center affiliated with a university hospital group. The other was smaller, newer, and its online presence was thin in the specific way that suggested it had been built for a particular kind of client rather than the general public. She sent both names to Fossey with a 3-line explanation and the words urgent, witness relocation in the subject line of the text. His response came in 4 minutes. On it. Don't move on the facility independently. Emily read it twice. Then she put the phone in her lap and looked out the windshield at the city moving past them. He said, don't move on the facility independently, Maggie said. She'd read it too, at a light. I know what he said. Emily, I'm not going to the facility tonight. She meant it. Not because she didn't want to. She did, in the way she had always wanted to move toward the thing that needed handling when everything in her was calibrated for exactly that. But because moving on the facility tonight, without Fossey in position and without Okafor's petition filed, would give Pruitt and whoever was behind him exactly the kind of incident they needed to reframe the entire situation. I'm thinking. Maggie drove. Emily thought. The shape of what was happening had clarified enough over the last 12 hours that she could see most of the edges now. Dravix had falsified an inspection certification. A man had died. Russell Holt had documented the truth. The documentation had been buried by people with connections to city infrastructure and, through Commander Shreve, to the police department. Gerard had kept copies. The federal case had those copies now, or would, once Fossey secured Gerard's voicemail. Holt's testimony was the anchor. He was the on-site witness who could put human testimony behind the documentary evidence, the person who had looked Gerard in the eye and heard him say he'd been pressured. Without Holt, the case was documents. With Holt, it was a story with a source, and a jury could hold a story. That was why he was in a facility with a number that rang without being answered. Not to hurt him, hurting him would create a different set of problems, but to manage him. To keep him unreachable until the procedural window closed and the federal case hit the wall it was being carefully steered toward. And the campaign against Emily, the traffic stop, the surveillance, the parking lot, the suspension, had never really been about Emily. It had been about removing the proximity. She had been standing too close to Holt when he came in. Her record had flagged in a way that made someone nervous. and someone nervous with police connections made a decision to push her back. The problem with that decision was that it had made her look directly at something she would otherwise never have seen. They slept that night in a motel on the west side that Maggie paid for in cash, a two-bedroom that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and had a heater that worked in irregular bursts. Emily slept 4 hours, which was enough, and woke up at 5:15 when her phone buzzed with a text from Fosse. Gerard voicemail secured 11 p.m. last night. Federal case team briefed this morning. Expect contact from lead AUSA by 9 a.m. Stay available. She sat on the edge of the bed and read it 3 times. AUSA, Assistant United States Attorney. The federal case had a prosecutor attached to it, and Fosse had briefed them. That meant the documentation from Gerard, combined with the timeline she and Maggie had compiled, had cleared whatever bar Fosse needed to take it from informal contact to official channel. She woke Maggie. Maggie read the text, looked at Emily, and did something she almost never did. She smiled first before she started thinking. A brief, real, unguarded thing. Then she started thinking. "We need Okafor on a call before 9, she said. "Ahead of you." Emily was already dialing. Bernard Okafor was a compact, precise man who communicated in short sentences and rarely used a word he didn't need. Emily had spoken to him once briefly the previous afternoon and had immediately understood why Russell Holt had trusted him. He listened to the same way a good nurse assessed, not passively, but actively, taking inventory. He had filed the emergency petition at 7 a.m. A federal judge had signed a temporary order requiring the specialty facility to confirm Russell Holt's presence and provide his attorney access within 6 hours or appear before the court to explain why not. 6 hours, Emily said. That's the window they have to comply. After that, it becomes contempt. Okafor paused. There's something else. One of the facility administrators called me this morning, voluntarily, before the order was even served. He said he'd been told by whoever arranged the transfer that the patient's family had requested restricted access for privacy reasons. He's now saying he didn't know a federal case was involved. He sounds like someone who realized he's holding something that's about to get very hot. They used the facility without fully informing it, Maggie said. She was listening on speaker. Which means the facility may cooperate to distance itself from liability, Okafor said. I've seen this before. People who didn't fully understand what they were involved in move away from it faster than the people who did. The AUSA called at 9:14. Her name was Renata Voss. No relation to the outline Emily had been given about this case. Just a coincidence of the kind that showed up occasionally and meant nothing. And she had the efficient warmth of someone who had been doing this long enough to understand that the people on the other end of the phone were not abstractions. I've reviewed the documentation, she said. I've spoken to Agent Fosse, and I've spoken to Mr. Okafor's office. I need to ask you a few questions about the chain of custody for the Gerard materials and about the timeline you compiled. Emily answered the questions. Voss was good. She went at things from 3 different angles, not to trip Emily up, but to make sure the account was solid from multiple directions. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, Voss said, I can't give you information about what actions may be taken or when. But I want you to know that what you brought to Agent Fosse represents a meaningful development in a case that had stalled at a critical point. I want you to also know that the complaint filed against you at Whitmore General has come to our attention as a potential element of witness interference in a federal proceeding, and that's being looked at separately. Emily sat with that for a moment. How long before anything is visible? I don't have a timeline I can share. A brief pause. I'll say this. When things move in a case like this, they tend to move more than one piece at a time. Things began moving at 11:40 that morning. Okafor called first. The specialty facility had complied with the federal order. Russell Holt was alive, recovering, and asking to see his attorney. The man who had been positioned outside his hospital room, whose name, it turned out, was Brian Culver, a private investigator formerly employed by a firm with documented connections to Dravix's parent company, had left the facility at 10 a.m. and had not returned. Fosse called second from a number Emily didn't recognize. I'm going to tell you a few things, he said, and I'm going to tell them to you only and not to your attorney yet, because your attorney is going to want to respond in ways that I need not to happen in the next 2 hours. Can you agree to that? Tell me. Commander Dale Shreve was served with a federal grand jury subpoena this morning at his office. The subpoena covers communications between the police department and Dravex, communications between Shreve and Paul Gerard's former supervisor at City Infrastructure, and communications relating to the traffic stop of your vehicle on the 14th. Emily was sitting in a plastic chair in the motel room, and she stayed sitting and kept her voice level. Okay. The subpoena was served at the same time as subpoenas to two other individuals connected to City Infrastructure and to the board of Dravex's parent company. Simultaneous service was deliberate. It limits the ability of any one party to warn the others before they're in receipt. Shreve won't know what Gerard said or what's in the documentation. Not yet. He'll know he's been served and that it's connected to Dravex and that the scope includes the police department's actions. What he does in the next 2 hours with that information is something we're prepared to observe. A brief pause. Garrett Pruitt has also been served, individually. His subpoena covers the traffic stop, the parking lot incident, and the surveillance of your vehicle. Emily looked at the wall. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the way she always felt when something that had been building for a long time finally found its shape, not relieved exactly, but very still inside. What about the hospital complaint, she said. That's moving through a separate track. The federal case takes precedence in terms of timeline, but the complaint itself is being examined as part of the obstruction element. Whoever advised Corby to sign that complaint made a decision that's going to be difficult to explain in a context where the underlying conduct constitutes federal witness interference. He paused. I'd hold off on any formal HR response for another 24 hours. That's what you said before. This time I mean it more. By 2 in the afternoon, the story had leaked. Not through Emily, not through Maggie, not through Okafor, but someone inside the city infrastructure office. Apparently someone who had been aware of the Dravex situation and was now watching the simultaneous subpoenas arrive and making a fast calculation about which side of this they wanted to be associated with, had contacted a reporter at the Red Haven Courier named Phoebe Strand. Emily knew Strand's byline from 3 years of reading the paper. She covered municipal accountability, the kind of unglamorous beat that required patience and a high tolerance for public records requests and officials who didn't return calls. She was good at it. Strand had called Maggie's office number, which was publicly listed at 153. Maggie came out of the bathroom where she'd taken the call and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at Emily. She has the subpoena story, Maggie said. She's going to publish it. She wants a comment, and she wants to know if Emily will talk to her. Emily thought about Fosse's request. 24 hours. Nothing that moved faster than what he was already moving. Tell her I'm available tomorrow. Tell her everything she prints today needs to come from what she already has. She's going to print it either way. I know. Emily looked at the ceiling. Let her print it. The story went online at 4:17 p.m. under the headline, Federal Subpoenas Issued to Red Haven PD Commander, City Officials in Dravex Workplace Death Investigation. Strand's piece was careful and specific. It named Shreve, named the Dravex parent company, named Paul Gerard without quoting him directly, and described the federal case in terms that were accurate without being sensationalized. It mentioned that a Whitmore general nurse had been suspended following contact with the case's key witness, and that the suspension was being examined as part of a broader obstruction inquiry. It did not name Emily. It described her as a hospital employee and former federal service member. By 6 p.m., the story had been picked up by 2 state-level news outlets. By 7, a television news crew had appeared outside Commander Shreve's home in the Alderton district and filmed him declining to comment through a partially open front door. By 8, the Red Haven Police Department's Public Information Office had issued a statement saying that Commander Shreve was cooperating fully with all inquiries, which was the statement every public official issued when they had not yet decided whether to cooperate and wanted to reserve their options. Emily and Maggie watched the evening news in the motel room and ate takeout that had gotten cold, and didn't talk much because there was something about watching a situation you'd built from the inside finally become visible from the outside that didn't require commentary. It just needed to be looked at. Gerard's going to need a protection, Emily said at some point. Fosse is handling that. He called while you were in the shower. Maggie picked at her food. Okafor is seeing Russell tomorrow morning, first thing. How is Sandra? I talked to her an hour ago. She sounds... Maggie paused. She sounds like someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and someone just told her she can set it down soon.
Not yet, but soon. Emily nodded. She understood that feeling from the inside. The next morning brought Renata Voss back on the phone, this time with more that she was able to share. Pruitt had retained a lawyer. So had Del Vecchio. Both had, through their attorneys, requested cooperation discussions with the federal case team, which meant they were already doing the math on what it was worth to be the first person who talked rather than the last. In Emily's experience, this was the most reliable sign that a structure was collapsing. The people who had depended on each other's silence started calculating whether the silence was still worth its cost. Shreve had not requested a cooperation discussion. Shreve had, according to a source Voss did not name but whose information she appeared to trust, spent the previous evening making phone calls to the city attorney's office, to 2 members of the city council, and to a number that turned out to be the personal cell of a Dravex board member who had subsequently turned off his phone and not turned it back on. He's trying to contain it, Voss said. That's not cooperation. That's someone who believes the structure is still standing. Is it? Emily said. No. At 11 that morning, Emily met with Phoebe Strand in the lobby of a downtown hotel, Neutral Ground, Maggie's suggestion, and talked for 90 minutes. She told Strand everything that was within her ability to share: the traffic stop, the parking lot, the suspension, the documentation from Gerard, the text she'd received about Russell, the night at the fire station. She told it in order, and she answered the questions Strand asked directly, and she did not editorialize about Pruitt or Shreve or anyone else because she didn't need to. The facts were the editorializing. Strand listened and took notes on a small recorder and occasionally asked her to slow down or repeat a detail, and at the end of the conversation she looked at Emily directly and said, "You were a Navy SEAL?" "Combat medic, attached to a SEAL unit." "And nobody at the hospital knew?" "No." "Why not?" Emily thought about it. The real answer was long and contained things she didn't have words for that fit easily into a newspaper article. The short answer was, because I wanted to do the work without the conversation about who I was getting in the way of the work. Strand wrote that down. The second story ran the following morning. It named Emily. It described her service record in the terms she had authorized: combat medic, 8 years, 2 tours, honorably discharged, and it described, with specificity and sourcing that Emily found impressive, the full sequence from the traffic stop to the federal subpoenas. It described the complaint against her at Whitmore General as part of an alleged pattern of coordinated obstruction. It quoted Okafor on Russell Holt's condition and his intention to testify. It quoted Gerard by name. He had agreed to be named, a decision that Fossey had facilitated by ensuring that certain protections were in place before publication. It was the kind of story that a city reads in the morning and then has a different relationship with its institutions by afternoon. Emily read it at the kitchen table of Maggie's apartment in Caldwell, where they had moved for the week, and she read it once carefully and then put her phone face down on the table and drank her coffee and looked out Maggie's kitchen window at the parking lot below, where nothing particular was happening. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Solis. "I'm sorry. I didn't know the scope of what I was told to leave alone. Call me when you're ready." She looked at it for a long time. Then another text, this one from a number she didn't recognize, different from the Russell's Gone number, different from anything she'd seen before. She opened it. It was a photograph, taken from inside a building through a window at night. The angle suggested a high floor, 4th or 5th. In the foreground were 2 figures she couldn't identify clearly, but in the background, through a second window visible from the photographer's position, she could see a room, and in the room she could see a desk, and at the desk, in the bluish light of a computer screen, Dale Shreve. And across the desk from him, in a suit she recognized from the hallway of Whitmore General's administrative wing, sat Dr. Ansel Corby. The timestamp on the photograph was 11:47 p.m., last night, while the second story was already written and queued for morning publication. Below the photograph, a single line of text from the unknown number. He asked Corby to hold the complaint and not respond to federal inquiries. Corby refused. Shreve threatened him. "I was in the building." Emily stared at the photo. Then she called Fossey. "I just sent you something," she said when he picked up. "A photograph and a text. Timestamp from last night." A pause. She could hear him moving, the sound of a chair, then, "Where did this come from?" "Unknown number. Someone who was in the building." Another pause, longer. "Emily, If this is what it looks like, I know what it looks like. If Shreve threatened a witness in a federal obstruction inquiry last night while under subpoena, I know, she said again. Fossey was quiet for 3 seconds. Don't share the photograph with anyone else. Don't discuss the text. I need to make a call. He hung up. Emily put the phone down on the table and looked at the photograph still open on her screen. Shreve's face in the blue light of the monitor. Corby across the desk, and whatever expression he was wearing in that moment, impossible to read at the angle, but the set of his shoulders said something, said someone being told something they did not want to hear. Shreve had made a mistake. Not the original mistake. Not the covering up, and the pressuring and the using of department resources to manage a civilian he'd decided was inconvenient. Those were the mistakes that had started this. The mistake he had made last night was the one that people made when they believed the structure was still standing, and they still had leverage, and there was still something they could do to hold the walls together. He had walked into a room and made a threat that someone else had been positioned to document. Emily didn't know who had been in that building. She didn't know why they had sent the photograph to her specifically. She didn't know whether it was someone inside Shreve's network who had decided to cross or someone external who had been watching and waiting for exactly this moment. What she knew was that the photograph existed, that Fossey had it, and that Dale Shreve had spent last night believing he was in a private meeting and had been wrong about that in a way that was going to be very difficult to recover from. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Maggie's name on the screen. Maggie, who was in the next room, texting instead of walking through the door, which meant she was reading something on her own phone that she wanted Emily to see before they spoke. Turn on the news. Emily picked up the remote. The local Caldwell station had a breaking news banner running below the anchor's face, and it took Emily about 3 seconds to read it and understand what it meant, and then she stood in Maggie's kitchen, holding the remote, and felt the specific quality of silence that arrived when a situation you had been inside finally broke into the open air where everyone could see it. The banner read, Red Haven Police Commander, Dale Shreve placed on administrative leave, pending federal investigation, city issues statement. And beneath it, in smaller text, a secondary line that had just been added. Whitmore General Chief Medical Officer Corby issues statement, distancing hospital from suspended nurse complaint. Says complaint was filed under pressure. Emily looked at the screen. Corby had talked first. Corby had talked first, and that mattered more than it might have appeared to on the surface. In Emily's experience, and she had more experience with institutional collapse than most people who had never worked inside one, the order in which people started talking determined the shape of everything that came after. The first person to speak set the terms. Everyone who followed was reacting to a narrative that was no longer theirs to control. Corby had filed the complaint under pressure and then, faced with the choice between continuing to absorb that pressure and redirecting it toward the person who had applied it, he had chosen the option that would generate the least damage to himself. That was not courage. It was calculation. But calculation pointed in the right direction still moved things forward, and Emily had long since stopped requiring purity of motive from the people who ended up helping her. She watched the news segment through once, then muted it and called Fossey. He answered before the second ring. You saw. Just now, Corby issued a statement. His attorney issued a statement. There's a difference. It means he's already in negotiation, and the statement is part of positioning. Fossey's voice had the cadence of someone managing 3 things simultaneously. The photograph you sent me is being authenticated. The unknown sender. We have a working ID, but I can't share it yet. What I can tell you is that the person was not connected to Shreve's network. They were connected to the Dravex civil case through a different angle, and they had been holding that documentation waiting for the right moment. Someone was running their own parallel track. It happens. Usually it creates problems. In this case, it created a timestamp. He paused. Emily, I want to be direct with you about where things are. The administrative leave is a precautionary action taken by the city. They're distancing themselves before the federal action formally names the department as an institutional actor. That formal action is likely in the next 48 hours. When it comes, it will include conspiracy charges, abuse of authority, and obstruction of a federal proceeding. Shreve is the primary target. Pruitt and Delvecchio are secondary, but they are on the list. And the Dravex board? 2 members. The one whose phone went dark and another who has been cooperating since yesterday morning. He paused again. Russell Holt will be giving a formal deposition next week. Okafor is with him now. Fossey searched for the word. He's ready. Emily looked out Maggie's kitchen window. The parking lot below was ordinary and still. What happens to me? Whitmore General will reinstate you. That's coming through HR channels within the next 72 hours. Corby's statement removes the legal ground from under the complaint, and the hospital's counsel knows it. The formal federal documentation clearing your conduct will take longer, weeks, maybe more. But the substance is already established. She heard him, and she noted it, and she didn't feel the thing she had expected to feel. Not relief, not vindication, something quieter and less defined, like the moment when a wound stops actively hurting but hasn't yet healed, when you become aware of the absence of pain rather than the presence of anything else. Okay, she said. There's one more thing. Fossey's voice shifted slightly. Your service record. Whoever pulled it in connection with the traffic stop, that was an unauthorized access. It went through a contact Shreve had inside a federal records interface. That's a separate charge and it's being handled. But I want you to know that the access has been logged, the contact has been identified, and the specific elements of your record that were viewed are documented. He paused. Nobody leaked what was in it. It scared them. That's why they moved against you. She thought about that. Scared them. The thing she had spent years keeping quiet, keeping folded away, had been the thing that started this whole sequence. Not because it was dangerous, but because the people who saw it were looking for a reason to be afraid of her, and found one they hadn't expected. There was something almost funny about that, in the way that things were sometimes funny when they contained a particular kind of irony that didn't actually make you laugh. Thank you, she said, for all of it. You brought us what we needed, Fossey said. Don't undersell that. She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then Maggie appeared in the doorway, coffee in both hands, already knowing most of it from the way Emily was standing. Fossey, Maggie said. 48 hours for the formal action. Reinstatement in 72. Emily took the coffee. You're going to be able to go home. Maggie looked at her for a moment. Are you going to be okay? I'm working on it. Maggie came in and sat at the table, and they drank their coffee in the quiet of the morning without filling it with words, because there was a kind of silence between people who had been through something together that was different from ordinary silence. It had texture and weight, and it didn't need to be managed. Dale Shreve was formally indicted 11 days later. Emily was back at Whitmore General by then, reinstated 6 days after Corby's statement, with a written apology from hospital administration that was carefully worded in the way that written apologies from institutions always were, full of passive constructions and references to processes rather than people. She read it once and filed it and went back to work because the work was what she had been trying to get back to this whole time. The indictment covered 7 counts: conspiracy to obstruct a federal proceeding, abuse of official authority, unauthorized access to protected federal records, witness intimidation, 2 counts, 1 for Emily, 1 for Gerard, misconduct in office, and 1 count of accessory after the fact to the falsification of public safety documentation, which was the count that connected him directly to the Dravex certification and to the death of the man on the worksite whose name, Emily learned now for the first time, had been Marcus Webb. 29 years old, electrician, father of a 7-month-old. He had died because equipment that should have failed an inspection had been certified as safe by a man who had been told the timeline didn't allow for the truth. She read his name in Tran's coverage of the indictment, and she held it for a moment the way she held the names of patients she hadn't been able to bring back. Not with guilt, she hadn't been there, she hadn't known, but with the specific weight of understanding that every institutional failure had a human being at the center of it, and sometimes that human being didn't make it to the part where anyone was held accountable. Marcus Webb. She said his name in her head a few times, and then she went back to reading. Garrett Pruitt had entered a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecution. In exchange for his testimony against Shreve and against the Dravex board members, his charges had been reduced to a single count of misconduct in office. He would receive a suspended sentence contingent on completion of the cooperation and would be permanently barred from law enforcement employment. His statement, which was summarized in Tran's coverage, described a department culture in which Shreve had accumulated a network of officers who understood that certain requests from the commander's office were to be executed without documentation and without question. Not because anyone explicitly said this, Pruitt claimed, but because the consequences of doing otherwise were visible and consistent. Emily read that paragraph twice. She didn't feel sympathy for Pruitt exactly, but she understood the architecture he was describing. She had seen versions of it before, in different institutional contexts, and what it always relied on was the same thing, the assumption that the people who knew things would stay small, that they would absorb the pressure and stay quiet and not be a problem, that the cost of being a problem would always be higher than the cost of staying small. The assumption had been wrong this time, but she knew, in the practical, unsentimental way she knew things, that it wasn't always wrong. That there were people who had been in positions like the one she'd been in who had not had an attorney sister, or a retired inspector with printed copies in a worn folder, or a federal contact willing to take an unofficial meeting. People who had gotten in a car alone and driven into the thing that was coming for them and not come out with anyone positioned to document it. Marcus Webb had been one of those people, in a different way. She carried that. The morning of Shreve's first court appearance, Emily was working a morning shift and didn't watch the news until her break. She pulled it up on her phone in the break room between a pediatric bronchiolitis case and a man in his 60s who had come in holding his left arm with a careful stillness that she recognized immediately and which required her to put the phone away and move. The arm turned out to be a cardiac event, not a dramatic one, and she caught it at the right point in the sequence for the intervention to matter. And the man was stable and upstairs within 40 minutes, and she wrote up her notes and felt the particular uncomplicated satisfaction of a case that went the way it should because somebody was paying attention. That was the work. That was what she came back to every time. Not the cases that became stories, not the ones that had endings worth describing, the ones that just resolved correctly because someone did their job. She saw Marcus Solis in the hallway on her way back from the CICU at the end of that same morning. He was coming out of a consult and he stopped when he saw her, which told her he'd been thinking about what to say if this happened, rather than letting it arrive without preparation. "You look the same," he said, which was not what he meant. "You look tired," she said, which was true. He was quiet for a moment. "I knew something was off. I didn't know how far off." He looked at her directly. "I told you to leave it." "I know." "I thought I was protecting you from something manageable." "I know that too." She looked at him. Marcus Solis had been a good supervisor for 3 years. He was not a bad man. He had told her to leave something alone because he had read the situation as a small institutional mess rather than what it actually was. And the difference between those two readings was the kind of thing that was obvious in retrospect and genuinely hard to see from inside. "I don't think you did it to protect yourself." He looked slightly startled, as if he'd been braced for something else. "No, I didn't." "Good." She shifted the chart in her hand. "I have to finish my notes." He nodded. She walked past him. He said, "Emily," and she stopped without turning around. "I'm glad it worked out." She stood there for a moment. Worked out was a strange way to describe what had happened. Too light, too clean. None of the texture of what it had actually been. But she understood what he was trying to say underneath the words, which was that he was glad she was still there, still present, still the person he'd watched do her job for 3 years. "Me too," she said, and kept walking. The sentencing came 3 months after the indictment, following a period during which the cooperation agreements had been finalized. The Dravex civil case had reached a settlement that included a substantial wrongful death payment to Marcus Webb's family, and 2 city council members had called for a full independent audit of the Municipal Infrastructure Office and the police department's internal affairs processes. Dale Shreve was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison on 5 of the 7 counts, with the 2 misconduct charges merged into the conspiracy conviction. His attorney had argued for leniency based on 30 years of service. The judge had noted that 30 years of service made the pattern of misconduct more serious, not less. Brian Culver, the private investigator who had sat outside Russell Holt's hospital room and who had been connected to the witness intimidation charge, received 18 months. Paul Gerard's former supervisor at City Infrastructure, the man who had told Gerard the memo was administratively resolved, received a felony conviction for falsifying public records and was sentenced to 3 years with the possibility of parole at 18 months. The Dravex board member who had turned off his phone received the lengthiest non-Shreve sentence, 4 years, connected to conspiracy charges and to a separate bribery count that the federal investigation had uncovered in the financial records the subpoena had accessed.
The one who had cooperated from the beginning received a suspended sentence and a fine. Del Vecchio. Officer Del Vecchio, who had stood at the back of Emily's car on the highway and asked her why she lived where she lived, had cooperated earlier than Pruitt and received a lesser reduction. He would serve 6 months of a supervised release program and would be permanently barred from law enforcement. Emily had seen him once in the hallway of the federal building on a day she was there to give a follow-up statement, and he had looked at her with something in his face that she didn't try to name because naming it required deciding what it meant, and she wasn't interested in adjudicating what Del Vecchio felt about what had happened. She looked back at him without expression and kept moving. Corby resigned from Whitmore General the week after his statement. He did not face criminal charges, his cooperation had been too early and too complete for that, but his attorney had negotiated the parameters carefully, and the understanding was that the resignation was part of the arrangement. His replacement as chief medical officer was a woman named Dr. Harriet Sung, who came from a hospital system in the western part of the state, and who, in her first week, walked through all 3 emergency departments with a clipboard and asked the nursing staff what they needed that they didn't have. Emily had been on shift for that walkthrough and had watched it happen and had thought that it was a small thing that wasn't actually a small thing. The Red Haven City Council commissioned the independent audit in the 4th month after the sentencing. Emily was asked to provide a witness statement for the audit section on police conduct, not as a primary subject, but as a documented case study in how department culture enabled the misuse of officer authority. She gave the statement. She was specific and she was factual, and she did not editorialize, because editorializing was not what the audit needed, and it was not what she was there for. The auditor who interviewed her was a woman in her late 40s named Jillian Morse, who had been doing municipal accountability work for 2 decades, and who had the particular quality of someone who had heard many versions of many stories and had not let that volume turn her hearing into something indifferent. She listened to Emily the same way she would have listened to the first person to ever describe something like this. At the end of the interview, Morse looked up from her notes. The section of your service record that was accessed without authorization, you've never discussed it publicly. No. Is that by choice? Emily thought about it. It was, originally. Now it's... She paused. It's more complicated. I kept it private because I wanted to do my job without it becoming the story. I still feel that way, mostly. Morse looked at her steadily. It became the story anyway. Parts of it did. Emily looked out the window of the room they were in, a municipal conference room, unremarkable, the kind of space that hosted hundreds of conversations without absorbing any of them. I spent a long time thinking that the quieter I was about who I had been, the more I could just be who I was trying to be. And I think that was partly right, but I also think... She stopped again. The people who came after me counted on the fact that I would stay quiet, that I'd weigh the cost of speaking up and decide it was too high, and when that calculation didn't go the way they expected, it changed things. Morse wrote something down. What would you tell someone in a similar position, someone whose silence is being counted on? Emily looked at the table. The question was a good one, and it deserved a real answer rather than a convenient one. The real answer was something she had been constructing slowly, out of all the nights in the 3 months since the sentencing, in the ordinary hours before sleep when she ran over what had happened and tried to understand what it meant. I'd tell them that silence costs something too, she said. That the cost isn't always obvious and it doesn't always arrive on a timeline you control, but it accumulates. And I'd tell them that the people who count on their silence are also the people who are least prepared for what happens when it ends. 6 months after the indictment, a proposal came through the hospital's Quality Improvement Committee that Emily had not submitted, but which had her fingerprints on it, because Marcus Solis had submitted it, citing a series of internal conversations that had pushed him to formalize something he'd been thinking about for years. The proposal was for a crisis response and accountability training program, developed jointly with Whitmore General's nursing staff and the city's Emergency Medical Response Division, covering patient advocacy, escalation protocols for cases where institutional pressure conflicted with medical judgment, and documentation practices designed to ensure that what nurses actually saw and recorded didn't get quietly reclassified after the fact. Emily was asked to be part of the working group that developed it. She said yes, not because she needed the recognition, she didn't particularly, but because the work of it was real, and the gap it was trying to fill was real. and she had spent enough time watching real gaps go unfilled to understand that the filling of them required someone to show up and do the actual work. The working group met every other Tuesday in a conference room on the second floor. 8 people, 4 nurses, 2 physicians, a hospital administrator who was trying to rebuild what Corby's tenure had eroded, and a city emergency coordinator named Desmond Park, who had the energy of someone who was just slightly too optimistic for the room and compensated by being very organized. They argued about language and about implementation and about what could realistically be embedded in existing training cycles and what required a separate track. Emily argued for the separate track. She lost that one on the first vote and won it on the third, after she came back with data on similar programs in other health systems, and a presentation that was deliberately dry and full of tables, because that was what the administrator responded to. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that made its difference slowly and in ways that wouldn't be visible as a single story. It would show up in a case 4 years from now where a nurse escalated something she would have previously swallowed, or in a documentation record that preserved the truth of a situation rather than the institution's preferred version of it. It would show up in the absence of damage rather than in the presence of resolution. That was fine. Emily had always been more comfortable with the kinds of results you couldn't photograph. She drove home from a Tuesday meeting on a night in late autumn, the same highway she'd been on the first time. Different lane, different hour, the Hargrove bypass running north under a sky that had gone fully dark at 5:30. She drove with the radio off again, but it wasn't the same kind of silence it had been before. The silence before had been the silence of someone trying not to think too hard about the thing that wouldn't stop being there. This was something else. Quieter. Less defended. She thought about Russell Holt, who was back at work. Not on active sites, his cardiologist had restrictions on that for another year, but in a consulting capacity with a construction safety firm that had hired him specifically because his name was now associated with having told the truth about something difficult. He had called Emily 2 weeks after his deposition to thank her, which had been a slightly awkward conversation because she didn't take thanks easily, and he was a man who didn't give them lightly, and they had both been somewhat formal about it until he said something about his wife that made Emily laugh, and then it was easier. She thought about Gerard, who had moved to the eastern part of the state to be near his daughter, and who had given a recorded interview to Tran that ran 6 weeks after the sentencing, and which was, in Emily's estimation, the most honest thing anyone had said publicly about the whole situation. He talked about the moment he signed the certification and what it had felt like to do a wrong thing because the alternatives felt impossible, and then to live inside that decision while a man died. He wasn't asking for absolution. I was just describing what it was like to be a person who did a wrong thing and then spent 2 years trying to figure out what that made him. Emily had read the interview twice. She thought it was the kind of thing that should be read by everyone who ever found themselves in a position where the wrong thing was easier, which was most people at some point. She thought about Maggie, who had gone back to Caldwell and her practice and her apartment, and who called every Sunday without fail, and who had not mentioned the week in the motel once since it ended. Not because it hadn't mattered, but because between them some things were simply held rather than discussed, and this was one of them. She thought about Marcus Webb, who had been 29 years old with a 7-month-old daughter, and who had gone to a work site where the equipment had been certified as safe and had not come home. Webb's daughter would be almost 2 now. Emily didn't know her name. She thought about her anyway. The bypass unspooled ahead of her in the headlights. The overpass came and went, the Ridgemore overpass, ordinary concrete and ordinary dark. Nothing about it that marked it as the place where something had started. Places didn't carry what happened in them the way people did. She drove under it and out the other side and kept going. She had not made herself into something simple by any of what had happened. She wasn't a symbol or a lesson or a story with a clean ending. She was a nurse who had gotten pulled over and had not been willing to shrink into the shape the situation required. And a sequence of events had unfolded from that point, and those events had had consequences that were real and ongoing and involved real people living inside them. That was all it was. It was also enough. The thing she had learned, and she was careful with the word learned because it implied a kind of forward motion she hadn't always experienced as forward, was that the cost of occupying space wasn't lower for staying quiet about the size of you. The silence hadn't kept her safe. It had just meant that when the thing arrived, she was facing it without anyone around her knowing how to read what they were looking at. She wasn't interested in performing herself for anyone. She had no intention of becoming a speaker at conferences or a name attached to the training program in ways that made it about her rather than the work. She was going back to being Emily Tran, ER nurse, and all the ordinary, unglamorous difficulty of that, which was what she had wanted when she moved to Red Haven and built the small particular life that had been disrupted and which she had, imperfectly and at significant cost, gotten back. But she had also stopped pretending that who she had been before was something that needed to be managed like a liability. It was part of what she was. It was part of why she had been able to survive the thing that had come for her and keep hold of what mattered. There was no clean separation between the woman who had brought soldiers back from situations they shouldn't have survived and the woman who caught the EKG shadow everyone else almost missed. They were the same person, and she had earned both of them. And the only people who had ever required her to be less than the sum of her own experience were people who needed her to be manageable. She was done being manageable. She took the exit north toward her building, same exit she'd taken every night for 3 years, and she parked in the lot under the lights that now had cameras she had specifically requested the building management install, and she got out of the car and stood for a moment in the cold night air before going inside. The city around her was doing what cities did at this hour, running quiet, running dark at its edges, all the noise of it gathered somewhere else. A dog barking on the next block, the sound of a bus on the cross street. Nothing dramatic, nothing that required her particular attention. She went inside. She hung up her jacket. She made tea she didn't always finish. She sat at the table where she had built the timeline that had eventually become what it became, and she did not rebuild anything on it tonight. She just sat, in the ordinary light of an ordinary apartment, in the life she had constructed and defended and returned to, and she let it be exactly what it was. Quiet. Hers. Not finished. Nothing about a person was ever finished, but standing. That was enough. Not as a concession, but as a fact. Sometimes the thing you survive doesn't transform you into something larger and cleaner and more legible to the people watching. Sometimes it just leaves you with more knowledge of what you're capable of, and you carry that forward into the next day and the next case and the next moment when someone needs someone who will not flinch. She had never wanted to be the person in the story. She had wanted to be the person who showed up when it mattered. Those two things had turned out, against her preference and without her permission, to be the same thing. She picked up her tea. Outside, the city was quiet and the night was still, and tomorrow she would go back to the ER and do the work that needed doing. And somewhere in that work there would be a moment, there always was, where the difference between someone paying attention and someone not paying attention would be the difference between someone going home or not going home. She would be paying attention. She always had been.